Good morning, colleagues. You are kindly requested to take your seats. I call to order the informal meeting of the plenary to hear briefings from eminent scientists and academics on the sustainable solutions on the economics of water, climate conflicts and cooperation, and early warning for pandemic preparedness. Dear colleagues, science is a leitmotif and cornerstone in the work and preparations of decision shapings in the GCEW. Our common endeavor to inform our discussions and decisions in the General Assembly continues today. Science illuminates the very foundations that our decisions are based on. Science lights up future possibilities and impasses. Science transgresses boundaries. Science helps to find compromise. Science unites.
We have first His Excellency Tharman Shanmugaratnam. He is a senior minister from Singapore, and he is also a co-chair of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. Then further to my right, we have Her Excellency Maria Fernanda Espinosa. She is a commissioner of the Global Commission. She was the foreign minister of Ecuador and also a president of this General Assembly in a couple of years ago in the 73rd session. And she is now a leader to make sure that we have women participation in global health leadership. And then to the far right, we have Aroma Revi. He is also a commissioner and director of the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. And Aroma is an IPCC long-term lead author and also in the Lancet Commission for Pathfinders, and he is the co-chair of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So without any further ado, Minister, the floor is yours.
His Excellency, Mr. Chaba Koroshi, President of the General Assembly, Excellencies and representatives of Member States. Thank you for this opportunity to brief you on behalf of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, which I co-chair together with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, better known in her capacity as Director General of the World Trade Organization, Mariana Mazzucato, and Johan Rockström. And I'm joined, as Johannes said, by Maria Fernanda Espinosa and Aroma Revi, who are both colleagues of mine on the Commission. We know we have a crisis of water that is local and global. We see it in the record-making floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. Just look at the last year. Just look at every region of the world. One nation and one region today, another nation and another region tomorrow. From East Africa, which has seen a record 4-year drought, leaving millions at risk of starvation, to Pakistan, where over 1,500 people were killed and 45% of annual crops destroyed, to China, which saw the worst heat wave in human history, and most recently in California, in the United States, where we saw floods and storms that came after a record 3-year drought. And that's what's happening. Droughts followed by floods in the same region. So we see the crisis with our eyes. But it's not just these extremities in the weather that we see that tells us there's a crisis. There is, in fact, a long-standing tragedy that doesn't make the headlines. Over 2 billion people not having access to safely managed water. After all these years of development, over 2 billion people. One child under the age of 5 dying because of diarrhea every minute. One child under the age of 5 dying every minute because of diarrhea, contaminated water. We know we have a crisis. But the bad news is that the crisis is going to get worse in all these dimensions. And it's not just going to put at risk SDG 6, not just putting at risk our ability to achieve clean water, safe sanitation. It's going to put at risk all the SDGs, from food security to ending poverty and inequalities, to achieving gender equality, because women, in fact, are the worst affected by the shortage of water in the developing world, to achieving trade and growth and ensuring peace within countries, cross-border, and globally. All the SDGs are at risk because water is what connects all the SDGs. And the reason why the crisis is getting worse is because we've mismanaged water for decades. We haven't protected the supply of water. We haven't managed the demand for water. In particular, we've allowed for overuse everywhere in the world. And that demand-supply imbalance that's already with us is going to get much more severe in the years to come. In fact, just in this decade, it is expected that by the end of the decade, we'll see demand for fresh water exceeding supply by 40%, a huge gap in global demand and supply. And what we are also seeing, and the science tells us this, the science and the evidence now tells us this, is that we have breached the planetary boundaries for water for the first time in human history. We've altered the global water cycle, and we've breached the boundaries, the guardrails that allow for safe human existence. In other words, we've breached the boundaries that keep the Earth system safe for humanity and for all life. And in particular, what we now see is the interaction of a water crisis with the climate crisis and the crisis of biodiversity. They're reinforcing each other, and in particular, water is not just a victim of the climate crisis. In fact, it's the first victim of the climate crisis. It is also a driver of the climate crisis. It's a mutual reinforcement of those two crises. The loss of moisture in soil and forests, for instance, is reducing the ability of these natural ecosystems to sequester carbon. And it risks turning natural ecosystems from carbon sinks into carbon sources in the years to come, which will have devastating consequences for the pace of climate change. So we have a problem because we've mismanaged water, we have now breached the planetary boundaries, and the situation we face is urgent. The next decade, this decade, is critical for us to take bold actions to restore balance in the global water cycle and to ensure that we achieve our ultimate objectives, which is universal access to clean and safe water and allowing water to support economic development and growth. The good news is that we do have what it takes to put water back on a sustainable track. We have the scientific knowledge, we have most of the technologies, we have the capabilities and we can spread them globally, and we have the finance. We have the capabilities and resources to address this crisis. The task is to organize it, organize our capabilities and resources locally and globally so as to achieve our objectives. Equitable access to clean and safe water, sustainable development, and enabling trade and growth to continue. Achieve our ultimate objectives, apart from all the other SDGs. And it requires that we reorient our thinking and our governance. We've got to reorient governance locally and globally. Locally, this is not just a task for ministers of the environment or water. It is a task for finance ministers. It's a task for the whole of government. And globally, we have to recognize what the science is telling us, that we are interconnected globally. nations and regions are interconnected through the global water cycle. And we have to treat the water cycle, the global hydrological cycle, as a global common good, which we have to protect and preserve in our own interests everywhere. It's in our collective interests. It's in the collective interests of all nations. And we can only address it if we address it collectively. We have to take action collectively to restore balance in the global water cycle and to ensure that we achieve equity and justice for peoples all over the world. The complexity of the issue, in particular this wicked interaction of water and climate, should not deter us from moving swiftly. What we have to guard against is to be overly daunted by the complexity of the issues and wait for a comprehensive, perfect solution. We cannot afford to let the perfect be the enemy of what is urgent and necessary. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of what is urgent and necessary. We have to get moving. Focus on the high potential opportunities which already exist out there. The high potential opportunities where we have the technologies and we can mobilize the resources. Just look at storage systems for water. We've neglected them, we've underinvested in them, and in much of the developing world, the infrastructure is not developed. Think about holistic development of storage systems. First and foremost, preserving natural ecosystems that account for the bulk of storage, the wetlands, for instance, but also developing built infrastructure for storage, because that's critical in capturing every drop of rain and preserving it. Second, reduce the extraordinary leakage in water systems today. What's called non-revenue water. It's a technical term, but it's the extraordinary leakage in municipal delivery systems. Even in the advanced world, there are many advanced countries where 40% of water is lost in the course of delivery. And in the developing world, you face very similar circumstances. The technologies exist, the management systems exist to reduce this. Third, agriculture, the biggest user of water today and a hugely inefficient user. The technologies exist, drip irrigation, smart agriculture. We can spread them, we can make them affordable, we can address this situation. Fourthly, industrial wastewater. We are not recycling the bulk of wastewater today. It runs off polluted into the system, and we're not reusing it. Again, the technologies exist, we can spread them, and we can reduce the incredible wastage of water today. And finally, we've got to move early now to ensure that the transition to a low-carbon economy, in particular low-emission energies, reduces rather than increases pressure on water. And if we don't plan this right, if we don't coordinate our strategies for water and climate, there's a very real risk that we're going to increase pressure on water systems as we move towards low emissions energy sources. Fundamentally, to take advantage of these high potential opportunities, we have to reorient economics and governance. As I mentioned, it's a whole of government and indeed a whole of society effort within our own countries. But it also means thinking about the economics. We have to value water. We have to value water to reflect its scarcity, its costs of production and delivery, and also its ecosystem benefits, its broader ecosystem benefits. We have to value water so that it can be used more efficiently in every sector, so that it can be used more equitably in every population, and so that it can be used sustainably, locally and globally. And we have to get past the idea that pricing water is harmful to the poor. Pricing water, in fact, is helpful to the poor because it's pricing water and having a system of targeted subsidies that enables water systems to be invested in, to extend across an entire population, and they enable equity. Because today's subsidy systems benefit the better off people in many societies. In fact, in the bulk of the developing world, subsidies for water, implicit or explicit, are largely benefiting the well-off, not the poor. So we've got to price water to reflect its scarcity and to encourage conservation. We've got to expand water systems, including delivery systems, to benefit the poor. And we've got to subsidize the poor, either through targeted social assistance or direct subsidies for water use. The systems exist. My own country, Singapore, has been practicing this for decades. Phnom Penh in Cambodia, relatively low-income country, has adopted this very successfully. And there are other examples around the world. Durban in South Africa, and several other examples. We have to price water and have a system of targeted subsidies to support the poor. Second, we have to reshape the way the public and private sectors interact. We are otherwise not going to be able to correct for the chronic underinvestment in water everywhere in the world, including the most advanced countries, where the water infrastructure is aging and hasn't been invested in. And we've got to expand the infrastructure for water in the developing world. It requires private finance that's called to address the challenges of the public good. And that requires a new relationship between the public and private sectors, which can be developed. There's some bad examples of public-private partnership, but let's not let that distract us from the many good examples of how we can structure contracts and structure regulation to incentivize long-term investment with appropriate rewards and some certainty for investors. It can be achieved. Next, we've got to develop, share, and drive down the costs of the technologies that are available, that are either at the stage of development now or already mature and available, so that water can be equitably used and sustainably used everywhere in the world. Everything from the mature technologies for agriculture, drip irrigation, for instance, to some of the breakthrough technologies, for instance, for industrial water, wastewater recycling, breakthrough developments in material science that enable membranes to filter water with an efficiency such that more than 95% of industrial wastewater can be reused. And we have to develop capacity globally, workforce capacity, decision makers capacity, capacity of farmers and women who have to be the ones at the front line of water conservation. We have to develop that capacity through international cooperation. And we have to finally strengthen the role of multilateral and regional financial institutions in supporting the developing world, particularly at the time of high debts and higher interest rates. This is going to be critical. Using the multilateral and regional financial institutions to multiply public capital and mobilize private finance. It's going to be critical when we talk about the global common good. It must involve additional financing for the developing world to develop water systems that are equitable and sustainable and supportive of growth. And finally, we have to strengthen global governance, which Maria Fernanda Espinosa will talk about. If we are to make science a uniting force, as Mr. Koroshi said, we must first plug the gaps in data that exist today. Gaps in data and knowledge will have to be continually updated. We need data, far better quality data, higher frequency, for early warning systems to be developed, but for us to also adapt our decisions and identify our priorities as we go along. But more fundamentally, we need a more holistic system of global governance for water, which is today fragmented and siloed, and Maria Fernanda will be talking about this. In short, let's turn this water crisis to our advantage. They often say that necessity is the mother of invention. It's not just the mother of invention, which it has been in water, by the way, but it's not just the mother of invention. It has to be the mother of good governance. Necessity has to be the mother of good governance. Governance to ensure equity and justice for all, particularly access to clean and safe water. Governance to ensure sustainable development. Governance to ensure a sustainable future for all of us. Thank you. And I now pass over to Aroma Reddy.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and my colleagues from the Commission. Why is water important? In the 5,000 years of recorded history, the ebb and flow of civilization, the life and death of empires and nation states across the world was tied to the gifts of nature, especially the availability, reliability, and as Sarman has said, the use of water to produce food, fiber, and even fuel wood. That shifted about 175 years ago when we discovered how to extract and use fossil fuels and fossil water, and apparently liberated ourselves from caring and respecting natural systems. Our populations grew from 1.5 to 8 billion in a century. The growth of human wealth, technology, and progress has seen no bounds since then. But unfortunately, that has changed. And I speak from the latest science and the evidence. The 10,000 years, the golden years of the Holocene are over. We are firmly in the Anthropocene. There is no more important proof of that than the fact that humanity has just crossed the planetary boundary on water. First, blue water, surface and groundwater, and soon, if we do not act now, green water, water in the soil for plants, trees, and even the rain. But water is important not only because of this transformation that we've seen in the global environment, because in the policy and economic worlds, it does three other things. So if you can change the slide, please. Water is one of the most important threads that connects all the SDGs, and nobody can know that better, in a sense, than the President of the General Assembly. He led this process here. So if you look at all the 17 SDGs, only 3 of them have a limited direct connection with water. In some senses, you could argue that even there's a strong connection for decent work, for industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So in a sense, water is the connector that connects all the SDGs together. Next. Water is also the key to climate resilient development, something at the IPCC that we negotiated over last year. This is just an image of projected flood risk across the world in 2050 if we do not achieve our climate goals. And the darkest numbers you see there are about 10 meters of flooding, fine? So this is very significant questions here. Climate change is not only about temperature rises, it's also in many parts of the world about dealing with water. Next slide. Water and biodiversity are also tightly coupled. You won't be able to see this very clearly, but the image is important here. This is an IPCC graph, which basically goes from a 1.5 world at the bottom to a 4-degree world at the top. The dark red is anywhere between 75 to 100% biodiversity loss in terrestrial and aquatic systems. This is a very frightening thing because, in a sense, water is life. We're at 1.1 degrees. We're fairly certain, if we don't act very clearly, that we will reach 1.5 very quickly. Most of our negotiations are taking us towards 3, which is the graph in between, the map in between, third from the top. And God help us all if we get anywhere near to 4. Next slide, please. So, in some senses, if you bring all of these 3 things together, there's a large unrealized development and economic potential to use water as an organizing principle to accelerate SDG, climate, and biodiversity implementation. This, in a sense, is a mandate of the Commission to try and see how we can build this frame and try and move this process forward. So the key thing is, as we face a growing water crisis from the local to the global, too little, too much, and too polluted water, we also live in a deeply unequal and sometimes unjust world that often neglects to care for the poor and vulnerable. And one of the most immediate ways that we see this is in the access to water. This, along with the water crisis, endangers, like I've said just now, the implementation of each and every SDG by 2030. It does this especially by multiplying the challenges of food security, very obvious, we're facing it today, health and human well-being, ending poverty and reducing inequality, climate action and biodiversity, like I've shown you, achieving gender equality that we often forget, dealing with sustainable cities and communities, and enabling partnerships and trade. And I'll underline the trade question because in the future, in a world which is food scarce, it is only a stable trade system that's actually going to enable food security, and that's actually trade in water. So all of these together, we hope, if taken in the frame of water, can preserve the peace within and between nations. Next slide, please. So human action, the action of us all, embedded in the current global economy, has thrown the global water cycle out of balance. This is actually, in some senses, unbelievable. But the real implication of this is that every person every ecosystem and every place, and this takes us to the 2030 agenda, is at risk unless this balance is restored. So this water cycle is a bridge that cuts across human divides, connects communities. It's made up of surface water, rivers, lakes, and the ice that we can see, the groundwater that we don't see, and the atmospheric moisture flows that science now enables us to see and measure. And this is the green water that I think is of considerable concern as far as we're concerned. The floods, the droughts, the cyclonic storms, the heat waves and fires that Thurman talked about, that we are facing with increased intensity in every nation and region today, and maybe more tomorrow, are not just local crises. They're a symptom of a global and systemic water crisis closely linked to the climate and biodiversity crisis. And each of them, unfortunately, are reinforcing each other in the wrong way round. They're tied, of course, to how we produce and consume, how we govern and finance, and most important, and this is a call out to indigenous peoples of the world, what we really value. If water is life, and we actually respect and love life, there's a very critical question that we have to deal with there. Next slide, please. I'll just show you some quick evidence on that very quickly. So, what are the challenges? Too little water. This is a global drought risk index from the IPCC, looking over a 100-year period of the growth of drought risk. Next slide. Too little water. Droughts obviously leading to water scarcity, agricultural losses, local food shortages, and wildfire. This again is a 30-year trend as we're talking about, and I've just picked out a few countries that have had significant impacts here, more than 10 million. Next. Too little water. Water shortages, and this I think is the most critical question that we have to deal with. Water shortages will cause large crop yield gaps by 2050. You can see here the dark numbers there are more than 40% yield gaps as far as agriculture is concerned. This actually means that if the science is correct, by the 2050s there will be 500 million. I'll repeat that again. About 0.5 billion people who had serious risk of food scarcity and hunger. This, I think, is the most critical question we need to deal with. Next. Too much water at the same time in the same places we've seen. Increasing flood risk across the world. I just showed you some evidence of that. Next slide, please. Cities are flood risk hotspots. Fine. Not only flood risk that comes from local precipitation, but those of us who live through Sandy in the city know exactly what it means when the climate shifts in significant ways. Next slide, please. There's also the challenge of dirty and polluted water. Too little water, too much water, dirty and polluted water. We know this very clearly, and this is one of our greatest scourges for young people in the world. 0.8 million people died annually due to lack of access to clean drinking water and sanitation. This is one of the most critical questions that we should have addressed, but we haven't got there as yet. Next slide, please. And of course, something that I think we need to think about very, very deeply. There are serious trade-offs between food, energy, and water. And the reason I'm saying that is if you need to get biofuels to deal with the climate crisis, you've got to plant them. If you have to actually do carbon dioxide removal as we go beyond 1.5, you have a serious trade-off between food security, water security, soil security in many of the most vulnerable regions of the world. This is a serious question, apart from the question of food security, that I think we really have to consider effectively. This is a systemic crisis. Next slide, please. So this is the bad news in some senses, fine. But the good news is, as Thurman said, there is a suite of feasible and effective solutions to the global water crisis. The question for us is, can we bring them together in each region to enable a set of transitions towards prosperity, human well-being, and ecosystem health? And I'll show you very quickly, next slide, some evidence of how this worked itself out. This is from the IPCC. It looks at different schemes. The top image there is of green and blue strategies. This is what is called nature-based solutions. In many cases, you can see, if you can see it very clearly, there's wetlands, there's groundwater recharge, etc. And then, of course, the more common gray strategies dealing with pollution, storage, a whole range of other questions. We actually have to build an organized system that brings green, blue, and gray together, and I think that's one of the core challenges of infrastructure development over the next 20 years. Next slide, please. Now, the interesting story, of course, you can't read this, and I know it's not important to read this. This is a map that we produced from the IPCC of 30 different adaptation options in the water sector, and it maps it against different levels of warming. So it starts with 1.5, goes to 2, then 3 and 4, and we've really assessed very effectively from the science with thousands of pieces of literature here, how effective it is, and if we are not able to achieve it, what the residual impacts are. So the science can tell you, not only across the world, this is a global image, but in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in Europe, and North America, what is actually happening and what can actually take place. So we do have a roadmap of how to put this together. The member states do need to sort of pull that together and make it work. So could I go to the next slide, please? The core question for us is, the global water cycle is a global common good. Restoring the balance of the water cycle through collective action from the local to the global is in the shared interests of all nations. This is not like any other crisis in the past. This is a global crisis. It will impact all systems in the world, whether it's food, whether it's water, whether it's energy, or anything else that we're talking about. So in some senses, the UN 2030 Water Conference, with the Water Action Decade, provides us a critical opportunity to help restore the global water cycle within safe planetary boundaries and simultaneously accelerate and scale SDG implementation, climate action, and biodiversity conservation. So this can, of course, in a very practical way, deliver tangible benefits to communities, environments, economies, and nations across the world. We must also, and I think this is the opportunity for yourself, and I'll speak here on a personal note. 8 years ago, I sat on the other side of the podium, and we presented how the SDGs would play itself out. And the PG at that time was the co-chair of the process here. I think the most important thing that we came from that process here was using development and the environment as an opportunity to restore and build trust in the multilateral system. So water, in some senses, is one of the core organizing principles to restore and build trust in the multilateral system, and I would commend to yourself the opportunity to do that in the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes, and thank you, President Korosi, for organizing this very timely briefing. Excellencies, we have heard from the experts, from the members of the panel, about the state of our water systems, but also about the inextricable link between water and development, water and peace, water as vital for the health and the well-being of humans and ecosystems. So we have the knowledge, perhaps not everything, we don't know everything, but we know enough. And we have the science, we have the technologies, we have the financial instruments to transform the ways we value and govern water. In some, we pretty much know the what. The question here is, what are the institutional, the policy, the regulatory transformations we need to ensure that water, or to be more precise, not water in abstract, but the water cycle which connects countries is governed as a common good. We have a shared interest, Aro just mentioned that, and a shared responsibility to address the water crisis. We also know that water requires a cross-sector and cross-scale approach, from local solutions to national policy designs, proper planning and investment, and from national to transboundary cooperation, leading to concerted global action. So what is the challenge here? The challenge is how to ensure that water is valued and that its conservation, storage, management, and uses are based on principles of cooperation, of sustainability, of equity and justice, including, of course, gender equality. You may say nice words, but how to do it? You know, I think that that's the challenge. And first, I believe we need to know and understand what are the tools, the mechanisms we already have, and to improve or to adapt them to the science and data we have today. And of course, from a systems approach, from a water cycle approach. And second, fixing what we already have must not be enough due to the complexity and the gravity of the issue. As we heard, water intersects with practically all sectors, all SDGs. So we cannot stabilize climate or fight poverty or hunger without water. That's as simple as that. So what we need is audacity, creativity, political will to address the global governance challenges that we face. And that might require, of course, to explore new mechanisms and instruments. So what we have, and very quickly, allow me to share a snapshot of what we have. And it is, of course, not a comprehensive assessment, but we have not had a UN water conference in 47 years. But however, there is a myriad of policy, regulatory frameworks, protocols for water management and conservation, many international instruments. There are about 500 regulatory mechanisms at the global, regional, and bilateral levels related to water. Most environmental conventions contain water-related provisions, climate, biodiversity, desertification, wetlands, you name it. We have SDG 6, but the whole SDG framework, as Aromar just explained, water has this connector role in the SDG framework. So no need to repeat what my co-panelists have stated. We have 2 water-related conventions, the 97 Convention on Non-Navigational Uses of International Watercourses, with only 37 signing member states, and the Convention for the Protection and Use of Transboundary Waters with 39 parties so far. It's open to accession since 2016. But both conventions are similar, they're seen as compatible, but there are many shortcomings and duplication, including the low number of state parties to these 2 conventions. There is UN Water. It's a UN interagency coordination mechanism established in 2003, a chair and office hosted by WMO in Geneva and DESA here in New York. It's a very nimble operation coordinating over 30 United Nations programs and agencies working on water. So we have 2 decades, we have had 2 decades for water action, 2005 to 2016, 2018, and to 2028. We're midway into the water action decade, and our golden opportunity to change course, the upcoming UN Water Conference. This is just to give you an idea of the spider web of current global water governance architecture. So evidently, the challenges we face are fragmentation, a silo approach, duplication, lack of coherence, a weak monitoring mechanisms, the water provision in existing environmental conventions fall between the cracks in a way, have either a very specific sectoral approach or are simply sidelined in the implementation and accountability frameworks. So to improve the ways we govern water as a common good, we need to transit from a sectoral perspective to a cross-sectoral systemic approach, from a local or national resource perspective to considering the water cycle as a common good. So the starting point should be, as mentioned, to use and enhance, to improve the existing mechanisms and instruments, but also to identify new alternatives to upgrade, to better govern and manage water. But how do we get there? I think that the way to ensure greater coherence, consistency, cooperation, and effectiveness in global action, allow me to share some initial thoughts for you to consider. First of all, it is clear that we need to undertake a thorough gap coherence and consistency analysis for existing water-related global instruments, normative frameworks, and water-related provisions. We need to strengthen UN Water from an interagency coordination platform to a more integrated delivering as one for water. And this upgrading should require perhaps greater intergovernmental engagement. The idea to establish a water scientific mechanism similar to the IPCC for climate or the IPBES for biodiversity to strengthen precisely this interface between science and policy, including valuing water with regard to traditional knowledge, which I think it's critical. We need to revisit the water policies and frameworks of multilateral financial institutions to boost investment in water infrastructure, both natural and built infrastructure for improved water management and conservation. And this, of course, requires new and innovative economics of water, and that's the homework of our commission. The need to appoint a UN water envoy. We know that it doesn't solve all the problems, but there is a request, as we know, from 148 member states to the UN Secretary General requesting for a UN envoy on water. And perhaps a task is to ensure that the upcoming SDG summit and the summit of the future include a strong and transformational water action agenda. And I would like to add some key questions to you, Excellencies. The question would be, is there a need for a UN home for water? Do we need a new water instrument, or can we simply retool and upgrade the existing conventions? Is there a need for an intergovernmental space to discuss and decide on water-related issues, which we don't have right now? Is there a need for an overarching environmental mechanism to achieve greater coherence and coordination among environmental multilateral agreements? And these are questions, of course, that I see the UN Water Conference will be a golden opportunity to address and respond to these and more questions, perhaps, to deliver an ambitious and transformational water action agenda. And what we all want is a safer, more just, and sustainable water future. I thank you for your attention. Back to you, moderator.
Yeah, thank you, Minister Tharman. Thank you, Maria Fernanda and Aromar. I think you have given us a very inspiring and also a little bit of frightening overview of where we are at the moment, but you have also mentioned the possibilities that we have and the way forward.
President Csaba Kőrösi, thanks for organizing this. Thanks for the commissions. It was on the initiative of the Netherlands government that this commission is here, but we feel very privileged with its work thus far and look forward to its outcome report. Your Excellencies, some takeaways from the Commission. Stable water cycle within safe planetary boundaries is a global common good, but at risk. With an ever-growing overshoot and an accelerated increase of the impacts of our destructive capacity, backed up by science, established the reason why we need effective multilateralism. Multilateralism is the only way to govern a global common good. This is the kind of challenge that multilateral institutions were meant to address. And water is the amazing platform for coming together. It's a good, not a bad. It links everything we value with everything we want to achieve, and by nature strengthened us to come together across all our divides, our vested interests, and the borders and barriers we created. We depend on it in our daily lives, our communities, our economies, but also nature. Water serves all these functions, gets used, reused, and used again all the time, over and over, but this cycle is under stress. And it's on us to relieve that stress and give water the strength it can give back to us. The message of the Commission is also clear. Change is possible and doable, but it requires systemic change in our economic and financial institutions that currently do not value water. Such systemic change will cause pain and will trigger resistance. A mission-driven government, in partnership with all, a whole-of-society approach, can make the transformation happen and help share or distribute that pain. And that puts the ball in the court of all us presented here today. Can we do this? And we're not the only actors as governments in the economic space. The other elephants, the private and finance sectors, are not in the room here today. A shared purpose between government and private and finance is a prerequisite. Do we have that shared purpose today? And can we build it, if not there, and change and strengthen it where needed and possible? The UN is our collective platform for global political and socio-economic governance. International finance institutes are a collective platform in the financial domain. Can we bring that shared purpose together? And what will it take? The current void, as also addressed by the Commission, combined with fragmentation in the multilateral system when it comes to water, is not helping. It took us 46 years to come together on water with the upcoming UN 2023 Water Conference, and there is no perspective yet on the follow-up institutionally. 149 countries have urged the UN Secretary General to instate a UN water envoy. But an envoy, and I'm an envoy myself, just like a UN conference, does not change the world. Only we can, only you can. And what is needed to drive the change beyond the conference? At the UN, both in its organization and in the way we do politics, an envoy, a home for water, a UN water for strengthened coordination, plus a political home here at the GA, at least with a guaranteed position of water in any UN gathering, SDG Summit, Summit of the Future, but also our climate and biodiversity COPs, our summits on food, energy, health, security, justice and finance, and beyond. Water not only needs that home institutionally, politically, and in the hearts, minds, and hands of all of us, it deserves it, and we need it. Because then it can give back the value add it has. Investing politically, financially, and societally in water trickles down across everything we value and helps accelerate achieving the goals we so much need to fulfill. This change can accelerate the transition, advocate for it, and mobilize all. How far are we willing to travel and go? What are the steps you believe that can and must be made at the UN 2023 Water Conference? And what are the steps that should be addressed in the 6 to 12 months and the years after that, all the way to 2030 and beyond? This conference cannot end with only voluntary commitments that look like a postmodernistic flower garden, bloom for a season and then are lost, even if brought together in the Water Action Agenda. Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Monday, in addressing the UN's priorities, highlighted as necessary to be bold and ambitious. This conference is the once-in-a-generation possibility to change the way we understand, value and manage water forever. Now is the time. We cannot waste this momentum. It is our responsibility to act on water now and do it together. Let us not shy away from discomfort, because without discomfort, this change will not happen. And let us not underestimate and forget to capitalize on the connective, collaborative, and inclusive power of water. It depends on us as much as we depend on water. I look forward to the dialogue in the next minutes, but I even more look forward working with you all in the next 43 days until the conference, and of course the years after. Thank you.
Thanks, Henk. Anna, can you, in German we say, the last is bitten by the dogs, so can you make a short intervention, please?
Excellencies, President, representative of Member States, thank you for this opportunity to respond today to this panel with wonderful personalities who work so much for highlighting and preserving the value of water and the hydrological cycle within the context of the Global Commission. There are no substitute for water. In all activities, in all production function, water is a complement and a physical boundary. We must recognize the centrality of water in the functioning of the Earth system and in our economies. Water, in fact, is the reason bridges are built across sector, communities, as well as across systems. Therefore, nothing less than a new framework and thinking is required to build a sustainable future with this very special role for water and equity recognized. The UN Water Conference next March is a one-lifetime opportunity to provide the water community and its supporters with the means to reach out to all sectors, stakeholders, and governance level to ignite change and to bring a special focus on the very special care that water and the hydrological cycle deserves.
So our first intervention is from China, so please can you take the floor, China?
First of all, I would like to thank Ms. Kalashi, in organizing this very important and very timely briefing. And I would also like to thank all the panel for the excellent briefing. Water resource is fundamental for sustainable economic, social, and ecological development. Challenges of our time, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental pollution, are interlinked. Basic services such as safe drinking water is still inaccessible to billions of people around the world. Therefore, we believe that the international community should seize the opportunity and to find a path to accelerate the implementation of the water-related goals of the 2030 Agenda. China always attaches great importance to water resource management and sustainable development and has earnestly fulfilled its commitments towards water-related SDGs with positive results. And these results are closely related to some of the policies that the panel mentioned. For example, great efforts has been made to ensure the security of drinking water in rural areas. 87% of the rural areas in the country has tap water, and rural residents no longer have difficulties in obtaining drinking water. Farmland irrigation system has been advanced, and the irrigation area has reached almost 70 million hectares, carrying 75% of the country's grain area and more than 90% of the cash crops. And a comprehensive river basin flood control engineering system has been built, and basic capacity of flood control has been strengthened to effectively protect people's lives and properties to the greatest extent. We have built 129 major transbasin water diversion projects, and the national water supply capacity of hydraulic engineering projects has reached 890 billion cubic meters, effectively balancing the regional water resources, protection, and productivity. We also champion nationwide water-saving actions and strengthen water resources management. With only 6% of the world's freshwater resources, we've met the water demand of nearly 20% of the world's population. We've also implemented the River and Lake Sustainable Management System. This is an initiative that China took. This is to aim to protect the ecological environmental protection of the rivers and lakes. And also, we've actively participated in global water resource governance and have carried out pragmatic cooperation with more than 50 countries and UN agencies and World Water Councils and other international organizations, forming a multi-level and wide-ranging global partner network. China commends and supports the holding of the 2023 Water Conference. We think that this is a very important opportunity so that the international community can enhance its cooperation in this regard. We will actively participate in its preparation, work with all parties to achieve a positive result, thus making greater contribution to achieving the water-related goals of the 2030 Agenda. Last but not the least, I have a question after listening to all the briefings of the panel. I'm very interested in technology and finance. I understand that maybe for a lot of developing countries, this is a bottleneck. Finance and the technology, and from the panel I understand that the technology and the finance is there. So I think of climate change because we've mentioned that the climate change and water is related. So I understand that in the area of climate change we have an international consensus, a very strong one. However, developing countries still face difficulties in finance and technology. In terms of the implementation of the commitments, is not satisfactory. So how to make sure that in the area of water resources, how can we utilize all the accessible finance and technology and to give it to the developing countries that really need? How can we do it? Thank you.
Finland, of course, looks very much forward to the March Water Conference and will be participating with a large and diverse delegation, as well as making several national commitments to the Water Action Agenda. In response to the question made by the distinguished panelist, Her Excellency Mrs. Espinosa, on the need for an intergovernmental space to discuss water, we would very much see that such a space is indeed necessary, and we welcome the recommendation made in one of the concept notes for the interactive dialogues of the Water Conference to have intergovernmental regular meetings to discuss water, for instance, on the sidelines of the HLPF or other existing fora. And we look forward to elaborating that suggestion with other delegations in the weeks ahead. I have a question to the panelists that relates to what was said yesterday by the Secretary General of the UN on how we as an international community often make the mistake of planning only for the near term and failing to look further ahead and make decisions for the longer term. So how can the scientific community help us as decision makers by strengthening and downscaling long-term forecasting and scenario planning, so that we will have information on predicted changes in the global water cycle to allow for more accurate long-term decision-making on issues such as urban planning and agriculture. Thank you very much.
Next speaker on my list is Egypt, please. You have the floor.
I thank you, and I want to thank the panelists for their excellent briefs. It's very interesting that Mr. Armar Devi mentioned civilizations in 5,000 years ago. As many of you know, of course, the Nile is vital for Egypt. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt, as a matter of fact. I am sure many of you are also aware of the extreme challenges we face with regards to water, extreme water poverty. We face extreme water poverty. We have a shortfall of about 35 billion cubic meters every year. We actually, therefore, quite appreciate the comments made about the science and policy interface. Some of the comments about water governance that were said as a plan for the future are actually currently being implemented in Egypt. We have a national plan for water, 2017 to 2037. We actually use and reuse every drop of water 3 times in Egypt. This is not a matter of this is not a luxury for us. This is simply a matter of necessity. Second, I appreciate also the comments about the water envoy. This is an issue that the establishment of this office is something that has been supported by 150 member states. We think what was mentioned in many of the briefs about how water, in fact, is the least common denominator of every single one of the SDGs, I think makes the establishment of this new post quite important. My final point is actually a question. It's regarding the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. We, of course, value the substance contained therein, but since this commission comes out of the World Economic Forum, my question is, would we not benefit as the general membership from a more inclusive type of not reporting, but a more inclusive type of water discussion? I thank you.
Bolivia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, moderator. At the outset, I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this important meeting, and the distinguished panelists also for providing their expertise in this forum, and you, moderator, for your work as moderator. My delegation believes that the topics discussed today are of such importance to promote access to water as a human right. This is already recognized for the first time by the General Assembly through Resolution 74/23 in 2010 in a process led by Bolivia. Several speakers have referred to the need to ensure that there is justice and the existence of innovative mechanisms to ensure access to water and to put a price on it. But to value these proposals, we need to look at them in context and look at whether or not they would contribute to putting to our economies, or would they further the commercialization of our economies and the commercialization of water above the interests of nature. We've heard about the disbalance in hydrological systems, and we need to ensure that there is political willingness to overcome gaps, for instance, private ownership of water in different areas. I have a question for the panelists on this. Is there sufficient research on the compatibility of seeing water as a global common good and how that is compatible with privatization processes? Thank you.
Chile, the floor is yours, please.
I'd like to thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this important meeting. I'll be very brief. I'd like to tell you that Chile is seen as a country with high hydrological stress. The studies show that the cause of water scarcity is due to a lack of governance and water management. And to a lesser extent, although no less important, it's also due to the climate emergency that we're facing. And I'm currently speaking in a very sad context for my country due to the forest fires that we are suffering at the moment. Therefore, we believe it's fundamental to change and transform governance of water systems as a high political priority, which would bear in mind transparency, participation, and evidence-based decisions. My question is to the panel, and it relates to governance systems. Have you found any model which has demonstrated helpful applicability in managing the water cycle and access to water as a human right? Thank you.
I have as next speaker Morocco, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'd like to thank the President of the General Assembly for the initiative of convening this meeting between member states and eminent experts who have inspired us and enlightened us on the water crisis and on the importance of solving it before it's too late. I also would like to recall that Morocco had initiated and hosted the first water conference. It launched a vision for water and environment. And 47 years later, the UN will host a water conference next year. And we hope this conference will be crowned with an outcome that is commensurate with the severity of the situation and the international community's expectations, especially those of the Global South. I have two questions. First of all, with regard to this upcoming conference, of course, member states will be contributing and presenting their respective action plans. But we'd also like to hear what the experts, what you expect from this conference. What kind of outcomes could be expected from the work of this conference? And my second question is to my dear friend, Ms. Espinosa. She spoke about the need for a UN mechanism. I'd like to say here that the importance of this mechanism is not just about whether we can have it or not. It's about when it will emerge, and that is the pressing question now. We hope that this conference will lead, first and foremost, to the creation of this mechanism. And do we need a secretariat or a personal envoy for the mechanism? I think personally, a secretariat would be very helpful. It would be more bureaucratic. It would need a budget, but it would be more slow to take off. However, an envoy, as several countries had requested, and I agree with Egypt here, that there be a special envoy. That would be the most appropriate, actually, mechanism so that we can fight for water for the future. Thank you.
Next is India, please.
The topic is of high priority for us, and a lot has been achieved in the recent years in India. I will not go into the details in the interest of time. I'll go to the question straight. We have seen in the recent years growing tendency to securitize thematic issues such as water and climate change. We, of course, have a different view on such approaches. We see adoption of such approaches will only politicize the issues and fear that our collective endeavor to find equitable and sustainable solutions will get undermined by securitization of water or climate for that matter. Moreover, it may also drive us from forums and mechanisms that we have already created, such as UNFCCC and many more. So my question is, what is your view on securitization? Do you think there exists a solid, acceptable scientific basis for such securitization? Do you believe that securitization will help finding equitable and sustainable solutions to water crisis or climate crisis? I thank you.
President, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Hannes, and many thanks for the wonderful panel, for the inspiring thoughts. Two questions. First is linked to what has been brought up by Philippines and Morocco. What do you think the key elements of the UN scientific evaluation support could be? The second is both to the panel and maybe to the member states as well. It's kind of political marketing issue. For the time being, we call the March Water Conference UN Water Conference, and another name is midterm review of the water action of the so on, so on, so on. Not the most empowering. How would you give a motto for this conference in 3-4 words that would capture the water action that unites, that transforms, that gives a promise, and that offers the Paris momentum? Thank you.
I have a request also from Minister Thurman for 20 seconds, so please, the floor is yours.
I just wanted to respond to the very useful question from our Egyptian representative. We are, in fact, initiating a series of societal dialogues where we're going to bring a whole range of stakeholders together, including member states, as well as communities. I should just clarify that the Global Commission didn't come out of the World Economic Forum, but was an initiative of the Dutch government as a co-host of the UN Water Conference. But we are going to invite member states and a whole range of stakeholders to the series of societal dialogues in the course of the next year.
Our last but not least speaker is Kitty van der Heyden, please.
So I'm going to be extremely brief. You've all had the luxury of listening to the best of science and the best policymakers on an issue that is truly of global concern, and also an issue where we just do not have the luxury of time anymore. We are literally running out of time, not just for this panel, but really to deal with a water crisis that does not have the same sense of urgency as we have with climate. And I really hope that we can see that we have brought huge development to humanity in terms of reducing income poverty, but in the wake of that, we have changed the properties of an entire planet's atmosphere, and in the slipstream of that, we've changed the entire hydrological cycle. That's what we've done. And so, to me, now that we have science showing how connected we are as humanity on blue water, but also on green water, on water vapor, on soil moisture content, the only way to solve this is through multilateralism, is to do this together. And if I can make one plea with all of you here in this room, and I hope you'd have your pens ready or your notebooks, it is to draft that message to your headquarters, that this is not a technical issue, that we cannot engineer our way out of the water crisis, that this is a global political economy challenge, and we need leaders in the room in March. Because without leaders, we cannot have a whole of government approach. Without leaders, we cannot have a whole of society approach. Without leaders, we will fail to achieve the Paris moment of water. So please, write to your headquarters, get your capitals to do what must be done, and that is to send in your leaders. Because the next time we have this, quite frankly, if I look around this room, most of us will be pushing up the daisies, provided there's enough water for that. And we just don't have time. This is literally about the lives of people, about our economy and our survival. This is a byproduct of the way we're organized, our economic institutions. And so this is the time to show that we can learn, to value, to understand, and to manage water. So thanks to the panel, thanks for all the valiant work of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, and thank you, Tharman, for explaining that this was an initiative of the Dutch government. It is neutral, it is science-based. I don't want to politicize water, but it is a global political economy challenge, and we better start dealing with it. Thanks a lot.